And we want to pose a question for you to contemplate while we're introducing the session here. When your children and future generations look back at the early 21st century, what records will they find to show what you, your colleagues, and your organization did? As we begin, a few technical reminders. Please use the chat function on your menu to connect with your fellow attendees or ask questions. We'll get to those questions at the end of the session. And also generally, if you have technical difficulties, please use the Need Help tab on the platform. We want to thank Business Events Montreal for sponsoring this session. We appreciate their support on this important and timely topic. I'm honored to be the moderator of today's session, and I will be joined by three thought leaders to discuss the importance of legacy preservation to operations. The first, we'll hear from Troy Eller English. She's an archivist for Society of Women Engineers with the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State. And then Jeff Nunn, the exhibit developer and adjunct curator for space history at Museum of Flight. And finally, Nathan Brewer, the archival and digital content specialist at IEEE's History Center. Welcome, Troy, Jeff, and Nathan to our virtual stage. I'll share a bit about AIME's legacy efforts first, and then turn most of the session over to these experts in the field. While AIME intimately knows and has promoted many of our founders over the years, there are important past members who have not received appropriate recognition or whom we did not even discover until very recently, simply because their stories were sleeping in AIME archives. As a 150-year-old organization, you can imagine what's built up over the years. On the left is Ellen Swallow Richards, AIME's first female member in 1879 and a fellow of AAAS. A chemist, she was the first female graduate of Vassar and MIT, also becoming the first female faculty at MIT. She dedicated her lab to sanitary chemistry, which developed the nation's first water quality standards. Her work later came to be called ecology. A few years ago, AIME's member society, TMS, created a new Ellen Swallow Richards Diversity Award, recognizing an individual who, in the remarkable pioneering spirit of Ellen Swallow Richards, has helped or inspired others to overcome personal, professional, educational, cultural, or institutional adversity to pursue a career in minerals, metals, and/or materials. Included in the center of the center photo at the dedication of the first building in New York to house the United Engineering Societies is AIME honorary member Andrew Carnegie. And finally, on the right is the 31st US president from 1929 to 1933, Herbert Hoover. Prior to that, he served as AIME president in 1920 and had a background in mining. Until recently, these stories have not been prominent or widely shared. AIME's shift to focus on its member societies' legacies has changed that. As I mentioned, AIME is celebrating its 150-year anniversary this year. We are a federation of sorts supporting 4 member societies. Those grew out of divisions in our organization, and the Iron and Steel Division is now known today as AIST, the Association for Iron and Steel Technology in Pittsburgh. Our mining divisions are known today as SME, the Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration in Denver, Colorado. And then our petroleum division is now known today as SPE, the Society of Petroleum Engineers, headquartered in Dallas, Texas. And finally, our metals division is known today as TMS, the Minerals, Metals, and Materials Society, also in Pittsburgh. Due to the pandemic, AIME's 150th celebration, which will have representatives from all of the groups, will be October 2nd through the 4th, 2021, at the site of the Institute's second meeting in August 1871, Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We're excited about that. So to share with you just a few of the programming foci in AIME, we have been working on milestone recognition. During my tenure, AIME's celebrated its 140th anniversary, 145th anniversary, and 150th anniversaries. We also recognize prominent member passing and local section 100th anniversaries, and we send them congratulatory resolutions from the board. And we've also resurrected old traditions. For example, the Order of the Dead Mackerel, which is a fun ceremony, complete with a pin that goes to past presidents. We have also digitized quite a few archives. Publications, literally, when I started with AIME, were falling apart in my hands in our library as I researched things for members and the general public. So we used latent endowment funds to digitize them over a 4-year period. We understood that then that it was critical to develop a file management process, a platform for these, naming conventions for ease of reference over time and by others. And then we also shared those electronic files with our member societies, which led to the birth of the digital library managed by AIME's member society SME, called onemine.org. And lastly, we've done artifact preservation. As AIME ages, and this may have happened with some of your organizations recently, unsolicited donations have increased, especially during the pandemic when folks are cleaning out attics and basements. So we needed to develop an accessioning process, inventory catalog, and consider storage and display options. So I'd encourage folks to do that ahead of time rather than kind of be faced with that and scampering to do it later. We loan artifacts also to our member societies to display and take them on road shows. And then lastly, we've done a few other things in conjunction with IEEE. We've partnered on the Engineering Technology History Wiki, or ETHW. They cultivated that partnership back in 2012. You'll hear more about that from Nathan in a minute. And we have been proud partners since 2014. It's been a valuable way to promote our group's efforts and members more broadly to educators, historians, and the general public. We've also done oral history captures. We got a call several years ago from UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library Oral History Center and agreed to to partner to curate content for not only the ETHW, but then also for AIME's website and our YouTube channel. In 2014 and 2015, we captured 12 oral histories with them of prominent members and digitized another 17 archival recordings that they had in their files. And then with Berkeley's costs increasing, we thought we'd turn to develop the program in-house at AIME. Organic development of that has been challenging with limited staff and expertise, but I'm pleased to say that AIME has released 23 oral histories between 2018 and 2020 and has another 25 in process right now, including new Zoom captures due to the pandemic. So lessons learned from all of this that we've been working on the last several years are be open to opportunities and flexible, take risks, but test. And then cultivate relationships with history fans. There's always a contingent within your membership that loves history, and try to seek those folks out and cultivate relationships with them to support your efforts. With that, I'm going to turn it over now to Troy to tell us a little bit about what's happening at SWE.
Hello, my name is Troy Eller English. I am the archivist for the Society of Women Engineers, and I am based at the Walter P. Reuther Library and Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs at Wayne State University in beautiful Midtown Detroit. Today, I'm going to share how SWE's archives came to be, how they came to be at the Reuther Library, and how SWE has used its records not only to celebrate its heritage and the accomplishments of its members, but also to support its current operations and to inform its future decisions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as background, SWE was founded 71 years ago on May 27th, 1950. Over the next several years, the founders underwent the hard work of establishing the society. And in doing so, they created a huge paper trail. So the founders were very much aware that they were working against the tide to change the face of engineering. And they knew that if they were successful, their work would be remembered for generations to come. And so SWE formed an archives committee in 1953 to document the society's history as they were making it. Because of the committee's industriousness in collecting and saving records over the decades, we have a rich archival collection today that explains how SWE survived in its formative years and why it has thrived since. Next slide, please. But SWE faced a problem by the early 1990s. The Archives Committee had done such a good job of collecting important records that there wasn't enough room at headquarters to store it all. They were out of room. So additionally, SWE very much wanted people to write about the legacy of the society and its members, but that's hard to do when the primary sources documenting that history are hidden away in an office storage locker. So to free up space at headquarters and to facilitate public research, SWE searched for an archival repository to take its records. Usually, when you donate something to an archive, you give up legal ownership and control of those records. However, SWE actively used its archives and wanted to maintain ownership and control of its collection. So we're used to that kind of an arrangement at the Reuther Library because we're the official repository for several large and active labor unions, including the United Automobile Workers, United Farm Workers, American Federation of Teachers, and several others. So we're used to working with active records of active organizations. So in 1993, SWE and the Reuther Library entered into what we call a deposit agreement, with the archives placed in the custodial control of the library, but remaining the property of the society. And since that time, SWE has sent hundreds of boxes of paper and many hard drives worth of electronic files to the Reuther Library to be stored and made available for public research. So that storage arrangement was fine until the society began researching and writing commemorative booklets for its 50th anniversary in the year 2000. Reuther archivists were happy to search for specific documents, but they did not have the time to become deeply familiar with the collection, what information it contained, or in which of the hundreds of boxes that information might be found in. So SWE paid for a part-time graduate student to process or organize the collection. And by 2003, SWE had committed to paying for a dedicated full-time archivist at the Reuther Library. And that was a big commitment for a society that at that time just had around 17,000 members. But having just spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was in all those boxes, SWE leadership thought the benefits were worth the cost. I am the third SWE archivist, and I've been here since 2008. So for the past 20 years, SWE has committed to funding its archives, but what does the society get in return? That answer has changed quite a bit over the years. So in the past, SWE primarily used its archives to celebrate its heritage and the legacy of its prominent members and anniversaries, such as for articles in the SWE magazine or in special anniversary publications. But over time, we've also learned that the archives can support the society's operations in a variety of ways. And that is so exciting to me because now SWE isn't just using its history to feel good about the things that it's done in the past. The society is using its history to impact and influence its future. So on a day-to-day level, SWE staff and leaders ask for the history of various programs and policies to understand why decisions were made and to better inform their decision-making going forward. I hope when people have questions about their membership histories and leadership histories, I do background research for the fund development team on corporate donors' historic ties to the society so that they can make a better case going forward for current and future partnerships. The marketing and social media team needs content, and I have lots of interesting content. Old photographs, newspaper clippings with appalling headlines about women engineers, inspirational speeches, funny correspondence between members, and a lot more. And in addition to providing content for the magazine, the editor and I share stories from the archives on SWE's podcast. And the archives have also helped in some unexpected situations. When the marketing team was planning to rebrand the society in 2015, I provided them with a dossier of research as well as a warning. Members rebelled when SWE tried to change its logo in the 1990s, and the council even issued a cease and desist order. Members had a lot of emotions tied up into that old logo and had also ascribed meaning and symbolism to it that my research suggested it just wasn't actually true. So with that knowledge, the marketing team was able to anticipate and address members' concerns and emotions from the beginning. So by the time they presented their draft new brand identity and logo to, they already had answered all of those concerns. And they were successful in updating SWE's logo to modern standards. In 2014, comedian John Oliver ranted about the Miss America pageant scholarship and recommended that his viewers donate to SWE's scholarship fund instead. The society was inundated with donations that night, and the next morning I helped the marketing team update the website with historic information and data about the society's scholarship program so that they could demonstrate to potential donors SWE's longtime serious commitment to aspiring engineers. In another example, it turns out that actor Jack Black's mother was an active member of SWE for several decades. In 2017, when Black and his brother Neil Siegel, who is an engineering professor at USC, made a generous donation in her name, we used the archives to write an article about their mother and the donation, and hopefully they built goodwill with her family as well. Next slide, please. And we've been successful in making the archives available for public research too. SWE's collection includes a 1919 nationwide survey conducted by female engineering students at the University of Colorado. When the marketing team wrote a blog post about the survey and the terse responses received from some of the engineering departments, the story was picked up and shared around the world by numerous publications, including The Atlantic and Glamour magazine. Research and audio clips have been featured on public radio stations. The archives were used for a Google Doodle on SWE fellow and Native American engineer Mary Ross. They've been used to support many books and articles about its members. And last December, one of my researchers successfully defended his English rhetoric dissertation using SWE's oral history interviews, which he had found on the Engineering and Technology History Wiki. And he was studying the stories that women engineers tell about themselves and their work. Within the past month, the archives have been used by the National Air and Space Museum, a classical composer who is integrating a member's oral history interview into one of her works, and a producer who plans to base the entire second season of her podcast about underrepresented women in STEM on one specific SWE member. Besides being great publicity for the society, all of these projects contribute to SWE's mission to both introduce engineering as an excellent career choice for women and to be a center of research on women in engineering. Next slide, please. So those are just some of the ways that the archives have supported the Society's operations and heritage efforts. Borrowing a phrase from Canadian mystery author Louise Penny, SWE is a rowboat society looking backward at where it's been in order to move forward and more quickly and more decisively. If you would like to know more about SWE's archives at the Reuther Library, I made a two-part virtual tour for SWE's annual conference last year, which you can find on YouTube. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end of our panel, or you can reach out to me at troy.ellerenglish@wayne.edu or on Twitter at TE2, and that's squared with 2 A's. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Troy. What fascinating stuff SWE's been doing over the years. And now I'll turn it over to Jeff Nunn from the Museum of Flight.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a project that is sort of all of us on the panel are involved with, which is a nationwide effort by the historical preservation community to really wrestle with how we ensure that the future historic record remains robust. And it's primarily, we began looking at it through the lens of space and what's happening with space history at the moment, but there's really a lot of cross application that can really apply to any number of businesses in particular and technological disciplines. So by day, I am the adjunct curator for space history at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, and I'm also on the steering committee for the To Boldly Preserve project. Next slide, please. So first, a bit of background on the Museum of Flight. If you are not familiar with it, we are located in Tukwila, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle, located just south of downtown. We are an educational 501c3 nonprofit. A lot of people think that we are directly connected with the Boeing company, but we have a wonderful working relationship with them, but we are our own standalone organization and have been since our inception. We are a Smithsonian affiliate organization, and we are the largest non-governmental air and space museum in the world. It's a little jumbled over the past couple of years, in particular with the pandemic, but we had been trending around 600,000 annual visitors. We have 175 air and spacecraft in our collection, as well as tens of thousands of small objects and millions of photographs in a working research library on campus. So we really began engaging with what is commonly referred to as new space and some of the challenges of preserving it in 2011 with the retirement of the space shuttle. The museum's CEO at the time, Doug King, encouraged us to start looking at the emerging private and commercial space sector. And so we began attending industry conferences and working on exhibit content related to the subject to help overcome what we were seeing as a very public misconception that the end of the space shuttle program meant that space was canceled. So we were trying to dispel the rumors of space's death to reinforce that NASA was still very much operational, but then there were also all of these exciting emerging new players that were starting to make waves. And as we began to engage with new space, we started to realize some of the ramifications from a historical preservation and communication standpoint with this shift in how we were going to space. Next slide, please. So we then connected into the To Boldly Preserve project in 2018 when the organization launched its inaugural conference. That conference involved over 90 space history professionals meeting at the American Institute of Physics in College Park, Maryland, to discuss some of these challenges of contemporary preservation, in particular through the lens of space history. And the overall goal of the conference was to encourage domestic and international space actors to collect and preserve their history, because we were recognizing that as this shift was happening, there was a real risk to the historic record as this change takes place. Now, the conference had incredible representation. We had museums and archives, the National Air and Space Museum. As I mentioned, both Troy and Nathan were there representing their various organizations. We had NASA history centers. We had representatives from government. We had independent historians. But what was incredibly lacking at that initial conference was the voice of industry itself. And so that is what we have really set out to try to bring into the conversation over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So why now? What is happening now that makes it such an important moment for tackling this question of how we collect and preserve 21st century space? And if we look at what is happening in the shift, you start to see what we need to consider as we move forward with legacy preservation for the industry. 20th century space was very monolithic. It was primarily NASA with the Air Force working with government contractors, but that was pretty much the only game in space. It was primarily governmental, and as such, it was bound by record-keeping requirements. And there were very specific rules and both in terms of laws as well as agreements between agencies that helped to ensure that these records were preserved. There was for example, the NASAM agreement between NASA and the National Air and Space Museum, which declared that the Air and Space Museum would be the primary recipient of all significant pieces of NASA historical technology. So spacesuits, moon rocks, vehicles, all would go to the National Air and Space Museum as right of first refusal. And this was a very formal agreement that helped to ensure that the current historic record that we have, when we are currently in the middle of celebrating 50th anniversaries of all the Apollo missions. I think Apollo 15 was just last week. So 21st century space is very much changed. It's very much increasingly diverse. And what this means is that many of the statements that I make cannot be applied across the board, because all individual companies have a very diverse set of values and capabilities. Many of the companies that are making history now are not big government prime contractors as they were during the 20th century in space. And they're often making history with less than 50 employees. And so this makes it very difficult for them to be able to have a dedicated position for an historian on staff. And it also means that as we engage with them, for museums and historians and archivists, our main point of contact often falls to their PR team. And when engaging with the marketing and PR team, there's very much a translation challenge and differences in priorities between someone approaching and trying to tell the stories of the company from an educational and an historical standpoint versus a marketing and PR standpoint. They're also very entrepreneurial. With a lot of these emerging companies, there's almost a counterculture reaction happening against what is viewed as the bureaucracy of NASA and what could be termed old space. And this counterculture is occasionally to the company's own detriment, since government contracts are still kind of the core big business for the industry. And for some companies, detailed record keeping is seen as giving into that bureaucracy, and even down to the point of test documentation. I've heard it from folks working within the industry who had experience in both within new space and old space, that some of these companies have what they're referring to as a garage mentality, where it wasn't even worth documenting these tests, especially if they failed, and for other companies, records, it's very common both for small and large companies for records to be seen as a legal liability. And so there's a trend towards document destruction policies, which can potentially negatively impact the availability of archives in the future. The good news is, and the point of engagement here is that a lot of these companies and the principals of these companies are very much aware of their historical impact. And they want to be making history. They talk about how they're making history, but they're unaware of what needs to happen in order for that story to be available when it is history. And very much like Michelle was mentioning in the introduction, as it begins with that desire to capture legacy in those milestones, and then you can build out a more rich engagement on historic preservation. Next slide, please. So there's also compounding factors which make this particular moment that much more challenging, and which really apply outside of the space industry as well. Digital workflows and tools are an incredible asset for accessibility, but they make preservation incredibly challenging. In Troy's slide, she was showing all of these records, and she had that image of those 3.5-inch floppy disks, and it just made me cringe because you can access 100-year-old newspaper clippings much more easily than you can files off of a 3.5-inch floppy. So anyone who has lost photos to a crashed hard drive can understand just how challenging digital technology is to preserve long term. And so we're wrestling with, as things progress, how do you archive a Slack thread? How do you keep a YouTube channel preserved long term, even beyond the life of this other company, YouTube, that may one day be purchased or sunset or any other number of scenarios? And in addition to the diversification and decentralization of the space industry, there's also a decentralization of the media that is reporting on the space industry. And in 2018, there was a conference held, joint conference between the National Air and Space Museum and the NASA History Office, which looked at some of the challenges of 21st century preservation. And one of the major topics there was how the rise of social media and social media as a venue for reporting was impacting the quality and the way information is accessed about both space news as well as space history. Because you have these, one example is that you have CEOs who are very much driving the leading edge of that history making, but they can be thin-skinned. And on platforms like Twitter, they have single-handed ability to block reporters or block anyone who they don't like the way that they are being reported on. And so that cuts off access to these news stories as they are being made. And so how does that impact the conversation around what will be available and the quality of what will be available down the line? Next slide, please. So in general, what we're looking at in terms of what is needed as we move forward is we need a process that is very deliberate, collaborative, and flexible. And part of that reason is we need to have input from companies, from academia, from museums, from independent historians in order to make sure that this record is maintained. And it also needs, what we don't realize about the 20th century space history making offhand is that it was very deliberate. There were formal agreements in place, and we need to figure out a way to establish those in a way that works for a more corporate and a more decentralized community of space history makers. And we also need to be flexible. Museums and archives have a lot of very strong standards around how they engage with the public and how they engage with history that might not always line up with how marketing teams at small companies want to engage with things. So we need to find what works for both the industry as well as for the Historic Preservation Society or community under these under the current environment of what is happening in space. There are a couple of interesting developments on this that are good steps forward. There are some companies that are declaring free use of their press images for educational purposes. Some examples of these are Blue Origin. The Inspiration 4 mission has a statement on their Flickr website that declares that any of those images can be used for free. And when Planetary Resources was purchased by the blockchain company ConsenSys and eventually ended up closing shop, they made all of their assets up to that point available as open source. And there's also an interesting thing happening with the company Astrobotic, which is establishing its own corporate museum in the Pittsburgh area right now. And so they are looking to tell their company's story. Next slide, please. So to boldly preserve, since that initial conference and engaging with these companies, we're finding that a lot of them just don't know where to start. And so the latest in terms of what we are doing to help with that is we've established kind of a phase 1 website, to boldlypreserve.space, which has begun with building a library of papers that various members of the group have written, as well as a toolkit for companies that are asking, okay, where do I start preserving my legacy? What do we need to, what should we be preserving? Why should we be preserving it? And how we go about doing that. And then also trying to address some of the common concerns that we're getting from conversations with these companies. Next slide, please. So that is it for my presentation, and thank you. And I will hand it off to Michelle and to Nathan.
Thanks so much, Jeff. We'll look forward to, oh, I've got to mute that. We'll look forward to hearing more from you during the Q&A session. Nathan Brewer, now I'll introduce you from the IEEE History Center, and take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm Nathan Brewer, the Archival and Digital Content Specialist from the IEEE History Center in Piscataway, New Jersey, the IEEE being the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. In addition to managing the physical archives in Piscataway, I also run the Engineering and Technology History Wiki, or the ETHW, which I would like to talk briefly about over the next couple minutes. So the ETHW launched in 2008 as the IEEE Global History Network as a repository for all of the IEEE History Center's content. MediaWiki was chosen as a software package, as it is the same software package used by Wikipedia and the other Wikimedia Foundation's wikis. So it has a massive open source development community, and it's extremely flexible and can be modified to accompany a wide variety of content and usability features. Could I have the next slide, please? A couple years after launch, we started talking to the other major engineering societies in the United States, because at the time, the IEEE Global History Network was primarily focused on just electrical technologies. And we felt that encompassing all of engineering disciplines and technologies would make the content on the wiki that much stronger and much richer, as almost nothing today is in a single discipline. A lot of technologies cut across many different disciplines and scientific areas. So on the Engineering Technology History Wiki today, we have a very large website that encompasses all engineering disciplines, from computing and electronics to energy production to aerospace, as well as mechanical and civil engineering. And content is not focused just on the technologies, but the people, the organizations, and the social context behind the technologies, which really provide a full historical picture. Next slide, please. The site is governed by 8 engineering societies listed here, and the consortium is open to new members, and societies can join. The engineering societies that are in the governance consortium decide how the site is going to be steered in the future directions, as well as contribute a great deal of content to the site in their disciplines. Next slide, please. The site is intended to act as a repository for all engineering historical content, preserving its legacy. The website is indeed quite flexible, allowing for more than just articles as you typically find on a site like Wikipedia, but also a wide variety of primary documents, including multimedia. Since there is a typically large variety of content types found in archives, we want to make sure that the ETHW can house different types of primary documents, from scanned reports and other primary materials to photographs to AV materials. The website is quite flexible, and organizations can easily migrate their historical content to the wiki, no matter what form that content is in. Could I have the next slide, please? Historical preservation, and particularly preserving the memories and experiences of engineers, is extremely important, as it adds a layer to the historical narrative that might not be traditionally captured in books or other forms. One of the things that we aim to do is to collect oral histories, as well as what we call firsthand histories, which are member-submitted memoirs to the site, as both to engage and to reach out with members of the engineering societies, but to also capture their experiences and histories, which may be otherwise lost to time. These memoirs and accounts, we find, add a really valuable asset to the historical narrative, providing a human element that tells the why of how technology was developed, not just the how it was done, but from a technical standpoint that you might be able to ascertain from looking at patents or other things like that. It has the ability, due to its wiki nature, for users to directly submit content to the site themselves. And we really intend it for long-term historical preservation. So it can be accessed by scholars, educators, historians, and the general public throughout the coming years. And we've had an active Google Ad grant, which really does put it in front of quite a few people. Could I have the next slide, please? Organizations can join with a partner fee, and this allows them to contribute their material to the wiki and take advantage of the large user base that reads the site. So we have roughly 2 million visitors per year, page views, around 1.5 million or so users and sessions. And currently on the wiki, we have over 1,000 primary accounts, which are broken down into oral histories and firsthand histories. There are more than 3,000 encyclopedic style articles that span all disciplines of history, which include both articles on the technologies themselves, biographies of the people involved in them, as well as the organizations behind them, and thousands of archival documents, including PDFs, images, and audiovisual content. Next slide, please. All the content on the wiki is tagged by a 3-tier categorization scheme, broken down by technical topics, so users can quickly look at all the content on the site that falls under a specific category, as well as a full text search engine that can search all the documents that are on there and easily retrieve materials pertaining to any technical or other terminologies. We also tried to break down content into dimensions of time and space. So we have a map that plots all the historical milestone programs. IEEE has a milestone program, and I know some of the other partner societies like ASME and ASCE also have landmarks. So we projected these onto a global map, as well as a timeline feature where we plot major events over the course of a chronological history. Next slide, please. Due to the wiki nature of the site, anybody can request an account to add content. The IEEE does all monitoring of new users and content, but unlike Wikipedia and some other larger wikis, vandalism is not really an issue for the content. In the over 10 years that it's been running, we have had pretty much 0 instances of people adding misinformation or anything like that. So it's a major advantage working in a small niche field where it just doesn't attract that kind of negative traffic. Could I have the next slide? I believe that's it. So we'll be taking questions shortly. So thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. And like I said, AIME has been a proud partner of this effort for the since 2014. And we found it a very valuable promotional tool for our disciplines. I think I'll start with you, Nathan, unless we have questions from the audience at this point. Liz, are you seeing anything on chat?
Nothing specific at this time, Michelle.
Okay, so I'll just encourage people, if they have specific questions for anyone, to use the chat box and submit those, and Liz will be monitoring that for us. Nathan, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about ETHW partnership and whether the group is accepting new partners and what would be required to get involved if anyone has an interest.
Yeah, we are accepting new partners. The AIAA, the Aeronautics Engineers, recently joined this year. And the process involved would be to, we would have to pass a vote from the governing consortium, and there is a $3,000 per year partnership fee that goes towards site maintenance and development. But the partner societies in return do get access to this wide variety of readership base as a promotional tool. The content is viewed by quite a bit of people, and it does draw a great amount of traffic to oral histories and other historical documents that might not get the level of traffic that would come up if a society launched a new website that hasn't been established yet, amongst other places that link to it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, one of AIME's member societies, AIST, looked at the usage that you all were getting and was floored by it. It was far beyond what they get for their annual conference as far as the traffic coming in. So we appreciate that larger stage that you provide to our groups. Okay, and then one other thing I will kind of add is that one of the nice things I think about this effort, this collaborative effort, is that each group, each partner needs to provide a representative. Troy is for SWE on the ETHW Council, Jeff is for AIAA, and I'm for AIME and its member societies on this ETHW Council. And we have 3 to 4 meetings a year and discuss the site and what enhancements we might make, how the promotion's going, and any other preservation efforts that anybody would like to discuss, or any other collaborative efforts. So I think that's kind of a nice benefit of being a partner as well. One other thing, Nathan, what kind of content can be uploaded to the site more specifically, and what's involved with migrating content to the site?
So pretty much any type of content can be added to the site, provided it's in some sort of digital form. The primary, I guess, intended use of wikis is article content, like you might find on Wikipedia. So that would be text formatted by a hypertext language wiki text that is somewhat of a simplified version of HTML. So anything like a historical narrative or an article in a Word document can be easily uploaded to the ETHW. But it also has a wide variety of bulk upload tools that allow you to upload large amounts of multimedia. So if you have several hundred or even 1,000 scanned PDFs of archival documents, you can just drag and drop to the site and they'll all go up there. The site does support audio and video content, and we've digitized a number of archival films and audio recordings, some of which date back to the early 20th century. We found a canister of film from the 1920s in our archive that provided a really cool look at Eta Kappa Nu, the Engineering Honor Society, in their early days, as well as numerous conference recordings from the 50s and 60s that we posted on there.
Fabulous. Yeah, and we've appreciated the opportunity to share our oral history captures on the website. So, and they've gotten great usage results. So thank you. So let's shift to gears and Jeff, let's talk a little bit about your space efforts, your new space efforts. What has been the response from industry so far to your efforts?
Yeah, so it's been a little bit challenging engaging in particular with some of the smaller entrepreneurial players, in that they are, they're very much couched in, the new space movement grew out of kind of the Silicon Valley mindset. So they're very future focused. So when you start talking to them about, hey, think about your history, think about the past, it's a little bit incongruous. What we've found is it really takes kind of one-on-one interactions have been the most successful, where we are engaging in that direct outreach, because it not only helps them to feel more comfortable, because most of who they engage with often is the press. And so the initial reaction was sort of like, okay, what sort of muck are you trying to rake up on us, when we're really trying to support their story in a lot of ways. But it's those one-on-one conversations have worked a lot, and also engaging with the societies, the industry groups. They have been much more, I think, open to getting the ball rolling with this. So folks like the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, the Space Frontier Foundation, and so they've provided venues for us to be able to speak at industry conferences and the like, and get the word out that way. So it's been a slow but steady process.
And I imagine some of your society partners here can help you connect you to some of those industry members as
Yeah.
well, potentially. So that's great. So how could work done with TBP be applied to companies outside the space industry or organizations?
Well, I think a lot of the sort of surrounding contextual challenges are very much similar to what is being experienced by business across the board. Figuring out how to wrestle with digital technologies and making sure that those are preserved. Figuring out how to make things like document policies work for a company are not things that are unique to the space industry. And we've actually found, a lot of overlap with some of the aviation industry. Some of the challenges that we're wrestling with right now are things like aircraft maintenance manuals transitioning into licensed digital software. So a lot of airlines, for example, the engines on their aircraft, they now have a licensed PDF from the engine manufacturer, and so and they need to maintain that license if they want to repair their aircraft. So what that makes us think about is, okay, 100 years down the line, if we want to restore a 787 to flying capability, how are we going to get that licensed PDF when that engine manufacturer has no particular interest in maintaining that? So starting with that thought process, thinking ahead to those milestones and thinking back on what you want to have. I believe both you and Troy discussed that sort of mindset is really the first step in helping to ensure the record of your own organization's legacy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're fortunate that we've got wonderful archives to draw from. They had the foresight 150 years ago to be able to capture some of the things that they captured. So we are very, very, very fortunate to our founders, for sure. Finally, what has been the international perspective on the new space movement?
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening internationally, and in particular in Japan, where there's a very thriving new space movement, but it doesn't necessarily mesh with their traditional culture, the sort of salaryman culture, where the goal once you get out of school is to land a lifetime position essentially with a company. And in conversation with some of the entrepreneurs heading startups in Japan, there is definitely much more of it feels like a much greater risk for them than it may seem here in the US where we're more comfortable with that sort of startup mindset. And the other challenge that they have is a lot of the museums over there are based in are corporate museums. So it's the company itself has established a museum. So we had one conversation where a company was reaching out to us because they had gotten little interest from museums in Japan about preserving their technology, but they knew that the Seattle area had a large Japanese tourist base. And so they were actually interested in potentially providing material to us in another country, simply to be able to make sure it was preserved. There are a number of other organizations. I know the UK is very much starting to wrestle with the historiography of space, and there are a number of other countries that are really up and coming in the space industry. UAE has a lot of activity going on, and they are also engaging with creating museums and the like to capture and communicate that history. China has very robust sort of science centers and things in development around their sort of current moves in space. So it's really sort of a global challenge, and it has to be tweaked to fit the cultures and the cultural reality of each country.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say it's probably a challenging effort there. All right. Thank you. And Troy, I've got a couple questions for you. How common is the arrangement between SWE and the Reuther Library?
At the Reuther, it's very common. Amongst all other archives, it's not common. It's not unheard of, but it's not common. There are reasons why a library and archive would not accept this kind of arrangement. There's space reasons,
Sure.
physical space. So a lot of archives are running out of space. Boxes take up a lot of room. They have a lot of boxes. They don't have room to say, yes, we will take this large organization stuff. And then they might not want to invest money in a collection. Archival supplies are very expensive, and they might not want to invest money in preserving and housing the collection and then have the organization say thanks and then take their stuff and leave. So
Understandable.
so those are reasons why a library might not want to, or an archive might not want to agree to that kind of arrangement, but they are around. The Hagley Library on the East Coast specializes in corporate archives, where the corporations have deposited their records at the Hagley, but still maintain ownership. So it's
Okay.
out there.
Great. And I know years ago, the Engineering Founders Societies in the US turned over their Engineering Society's library to the Linda Hall Library in Kansas City, Missouri. And, we refer a lot of people there for any AIME archives that we don't have in our hot little hands. So what are some of the benefits and drawbacks for an organization to house its collections at publicly accessible archive?
Yeah, so from a researcher's standpoint, from a scholarly research standpoint, it adds legitimacy, I think, to the history. There are lots of corporate archives who may or may not let you look at their stuff, and they may or may not selectively curate their stuff to make the organization look the best that they possibly can. But when the materials are housed in a public institution, you're laying it all out there, and it is also convenient in archives if you're working in a one-person shop. We're called lone arrangers, where you are you don't have a lot of expertise to lean on. You have to do it all, and you don't have time to do
Right.
any of it like fantastically well. So if deposit your records or donate your records to a public library, to a public archive. They already have the systems in place to handle your materials according to the best standards.
Okay.
So.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And finally, we had a question from the audience on whether SWE pays the library for the space and resources used.
Originally in 1993, they paid a set fee for every box that they shipped to the Reuther, and that was it. When SWE hired a full-time archivist, part of the agreement is that they pay for the archivist and there is no storage fee. So now they can send as much as they want, as much as we have room for on the shelves or on our servers.
Okay, great. Thanks for participating, everybody. I think we're almost at the end of our time here. Unless we have any other questions from the audience, or Liz, if you've seen any, I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their fascinating stories about what you guys are doing as far as legacy preservation for your organizations. It's certainly and to operationalize that especially, which I think is the important thing. So thank you all for participating. And anything else from your perspective, Liz, we need to deal with?
No, thank you all, and thank you, Michelle, for moderating. Just a reminder that we do have a break coming up here until 3 p.m. Eastern, and then we will close off the session or the day today with our Future of Meetings panel, which is at 3 p.m. Eastern, and then we have happy hours, virtual happy hours to close out the day for everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone. See you later.